In a forgotten corner of the world, tucked between withered hills and a river that bled red during the rains, there lay a village so worn by hardship that even the trees seemed to lean away from it, whispering warnings to the wind. Life here was a matter of endurance. The sun baked the cracked earth without mercy, and when night fell, it brought no comfort, only a coldness that crept into bones and dreams alike. The people of this village bore their suffering with downturned eyes and heavy hearts, carrying the weight of countless generations who had known little else. It was a place where hope was a rumor and laughter, a rare and suspicious sound. In a small clay house at the village's edge, there once lived a girl named Amara. Before her world was shackled by darkness, she had known a love as fragile and fleeting as a butterfly's wing. Her father, a man of rough hands and soft words, had carved out a living as a potter, shaping cracked clay into vessels that were beautiful in their imperfection. He would sit her on his lap, his calloused hands guiding her tiny fingers as she molded her first uneven bowls, praising her even when they collapsed into lumps. Her mother, though often tired, sang as she worked, her voice lilting like the river in gentler seasons. They had little in the way of possessions, but within their walls there had been warmth, a glow that no drought or famine could fully extinguish. The village, however, was not kind to dreamers. Whispers floated through the narrow alleys and broken fields, tales as old as the cracked earth itself. There were stories of those who dared to seek more, who dared to defy their fate, and the brutal lessons they were taught. Vengeance was not seen as a sin here but as a natural force, like the rains that flooded the river or the winds that tore roofs from houses. Justice in this land was not given by councils or courts. It was seized by those wronged, often at the cost of blood. Children grew up hearing tales of spirits who watched over the wronged, lending strength to the vengeful and curses to the wicked. Fires that consumed houses without cause, animals that turned on their masters, crops that withered overnight. These were not misfortunes, but signs that justice had been served, in a way as wild and unforgiving as the land itself. It was in this harsh, brittle world that Amara's father fell ill. Some said it was the coughing sickness, others muttered of curses placed by jealous rivals. Amara remembered sitting by his bedside, clutching his hand as he coughed and wheezed, his strong body shrinking into a husk of itself. His death came not with drama, but with a quiet, final sigh, as if he were simply too tired to continue. His passing left a void too vast for words, and the house, once lively with the smells of clay and the sounds of song, fell into silence so deep it seemed to hum. For a time Amara and her mother clung to each other, bound by grief. But sorrow was a luxury they could not afford for long. The village demanded its dues, taxes in grain, water, labor. Without a man to speak for them, they were like leaves in a storm, buffeted by the disdain of others. The few villagers who offered kindness did so with pitying eyes, and pity in this place was nearly as deadly as cruelty. The river ran low that year, the crops failed, and hunger gnawed at the village like rats in the dark. It was then, when the days were shortest and the nights longest, that a man came to their door. His name was Idris, a traveler with smooth words and promises as sweet as fermented honey. He offered strength, protection, a future. He offered hope, and in a world such as theirs, hope was a currency more valuable than gold. Amara, young as she was, sensed a wrongness about him, a slithering undercurrent beneath his smiles. But her mother, desperate and weary, clung to the possibility of salvation. Idris came into their lives not like a storm, but like a slow, creeping mist, seeping into every crack and hollow. In the beginning he was generous. He brought food, fixed broken parts of the house, laughed with the villagers, who were all too willing to embrace a man who claimed strength during a time of so much weakness. Amara watched from the shadows, wary. She heard the way he spoke to her mother in low, urgent tones, saw the way his eyes lingered not just with love, but with ownership. The old stories spoke of such men, those who seemed to walk in daylight but whose hearts belonged to the dark places beneath the earth. And the spirits that whispered justice into the ears of the wronged, they too watched, waiting. In the village's cracked memory, it was said that when injustice festered too long, the land itself would call for balance. The river would rise, the fires would come, and the innocent would find strength where none should exist. Amara did not yet know it, but those whispers would one day become her own. Amara's mother had never truly been the same after her husband's death. The man who had been her protector, her love, was gone, leaving behind only the weight of his absence. 4 months, Amara watched her mother mourn, retreating into silence, her eyes hollow and lost. She didn't notice the subtle changes at first, the way her mother's shoulders seemed to carry an extra burden, the way she looked at the door with a sense of hope that never quite reached her heart. Then he came into their lives, the man who would become Amara's stepfather. He arrived like a breath of fresh air, his charm filling the empty spaces in their small cottage. His name was Idris, and from the moment he set foot in their home, he seemed to take control of everything. He was tall, handsome, with a smile that could disarm even the most guarded of hearts. His voice was smooth, his laughter rich with warmth, and for a while, it seemed like he would be the one to mend the broken pieces of their family. But beneath that polished exterior there were cracks. At first it was subtle. Amara could sense the way her mother's eyes softened when she spoke to him, the way she nodded to his every suggestion, even when it seemed to cost her something. The affection between them was palpable, but there was something strange about it. A coldness in the way he touched her mother's hand, as if it wasn't a gesture of love but of ownership. Amara noticed it but couldn't quite place her finger on it. After all, he was still a stranger in their home, a man she had not chosen, a man who had entered their lives without permission. Soon the signs became harder to ignore. Idris began to make demands of their home that seemed small at first but quickly grew more frequent. He rearranged their furniture, moving everything to suit his taste, as though he were the true head of the house. He became overly protective of Amara's mother, questioning her about even the simplest decisions she made. It wasn't long before the atmosphere in the house began to change. Idris's charm faded as his presence grew more dominating. He would often disappear for hours, leaving Amara alone with her mother. When he returned, there was an edge to his demeanor, something darker in his eyes. He had a way of speaking to her mother that made her shrink back in shame, and although Amara could not always understand the words, she could feel the tension rising with every passing day. Idris's smile began to seem forced, his kindness shallow. At times, when Amara crossed his path, he would give her a look, a cold, calculating glance, that made her shiver. It was as though he had already begun to see her as something lesser, something insignificant. Yet he would quickly mask it with that same smile, the one that made her mother trust him even more. In the quiet moments, when her mother was lost in thought or too tired to notice, Amara began to wonder whether this charming man could truly be the man he appeared to be. There was something underneath the surface, something hidden, and as the days passed, Amara found herself more and more disturbed by the growing sense that she was not the only one being watched. At first, the changes were subtle, almost unnoticeable against the backdrop of daily struggle. Idris carried himself with a kind of rough affection that seemed, from the outside, like the gestures of a man trying to build a broken family. He would ruffle Amara's hair when others were watching, his hand lingering just a little too long, his smiles a fraction too wide. Behind closed doors, though, the warmth drained from his voice, and a sharpness began to seep into his words like a slow-acting poison. He began with small comments, carefully planted seeds of doubt. "Amara is not like other children," he would say to the villagers during market days, chuckling as if he meant no harm. "She sees things, hears things, sometimes I worry for her. For all of us." Spoken with a concerned frown, these words wrapped themselves around the ears of those desperate for gossip, who clutched to any distraction from their own misery. Amara, sensitive to every shift in the air, felt the growing distance. Children who had once shared stones and seeds with her now crossed the path when they saw her coming. Mothers whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. Even the village elder, a man who had once praised her father's craftsmanship, looked through her as if she were nothing more than a wisp of mist. She tried to approach her mother, to cling to her, but her mother's arms, once so quick to gather her close, now hesitated, trembling with uncertainty. Idris wove his web with patience. He told stories of curses, reminding the villagers of the old legends they half believed. He hinted that Amara had brought misfortune upon their home, that ever since she was born, hardship had followed like a shadow. In a village where misfortune was a tangible enemy, easy explanations were welcomed like old friends. One evening, while the sun bled itself dry behind the mountains, Idris confronted Amara directly. His face, once so eager to charm, was a mask of disdain. "You're not right, girl," he hissed. "You bring darkness into this house. Into this village." His hand, heavy and calloused, closed around her wrist like a man grabbing a snake. "I will protect your mother from you, even if it means protecting her from herself." The first time he locked her away, it was done under the guise of kindness. He had prepared a corner of the house, the small, crumbling storage room at the back, where broken tools and forgotten pots gathered dust. "For your own good," he said as he ushered her inside. "Until we can be sure the spirits leave you be." The door closed with a heavy thud, the bolt sliding into place like the snapping of a trap. At first, Amara was too stunned to react. She sat in the dimness, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's broken crafts, the stale air thick with dust and despair. The only light came from a small, cracked window high above her head, too small even for a bird to slip through. Days blurred into nights. Idris would sometimes open the door just enough to toss in a scrap of food or a cracked cup of water. Her mother's face appeared once, shadowed and tear-streaked, before vanishing into the safety of denial. Amara begged, pleaded, cried until her voice was raw, but the walls answered her with silence. She was forgotten by the village, abandoned by the mother who once sang her lullabies, betrayed by the world that had never truly been hers to begin with. The whispers outside grew louder. Villagers claimed they had seen her staring at them with unnatural eyes, that their goats grew sick after she passed by. A woman insisted her child developed a fever after brushing against Amara's sleeve weeks before. Idris did nothing to dispel these fears. In fact, he fed them, careful to cloak his words in sorrow and resignation. "We pray for her," he would say with a heavy sigh. "We pray every day that the spirits will release her." In the darkness, Amara's thoughts twisted and turned like roots searching for water. Fear gnawed at her in the beginning, making her jump at every creak of the house, every mutter outside her prison. But as the days stretched into weeks, something colder and harder began to take root. She realized that crying did nothing. Begging did nothing. She was alone in a world that had already decided she was an enemy. She remembered the old tales, of spirits who watched the unjust, of fires that consumed the wicked. And though the fear never fully left her, it began to share space with something new, a quiet, seething rage. Not a wild, screaming fury, but a cold ember that burned low and steady, waiting for a day when she would no longer be the one locked behind doors. In the suffocating silence of her cage, Amara made herself a silent vow. If the world had no place for her innocence, then she would carve a place for her vengeance. And when she did, there would be no forgiveness. Time lost its meaning inside the cramped, suffocating space that became Amara's world. The days blurred together into a dull, endless ache, each one indistinguishable from the last. Hunger gnawed at her belly with relentless teeth, a constant companion that made her body light and her head swim. Sometimes Idris would remember to bring her stale crusts of bread, cracked and crawling with ants. Other times she would go days with nothing but muddy water in a rusted cup, her ribs sharp against her skin, her legs too weak to stand for more than a few moments at a time. The seasons outside her prison shifted with a cruel beauty she could only glimpse through the tiny dirt-smeared window above. In the summer she would sweat until her clothes clung to her skin like a second, filthy layer. The heat pressed down on her, thick and suffocating, stealing her breath. She would watch the sun creep across the patch of wall each day, tracing its arc as if it were the hand of a clock only she could see. In winter the cold bit deep into her bones. Frost painted the edges of the window, and her breath came in visible puffs. Her fingers would go numb, and the thin rags Idris allowed her were useless against the chill. She would curl into herself, shivering violently, her teeth chattering a painful rhythm in the dead silence. There were times when the loneliness was worse than the hunger, worse even than the cold. Days when not a single footstep passed by the door, when she wondered if the world beyond had simply ceased to exist. Her mind would drift into strange places during those long silences, conjuring voices from the past. Her father humming a tune, her mother calling her in from the riverbanks. She would answer them sometimes, whispering back, only to realize she was talking to ghosts. Eventually, even the comfort of memories began to rot, turning sour in her mouth. She could no longer remember the precise shade of her mother's hair, or the exact shape of her father's hands as they shaped the clay. Pain became a familiar language. Her body wore bruises like a second skin, from where she had stumbled in the dark, from where Idris's anger sometimes found her when he bothered to open the door. Her skin itched constantly from the grime that caked it, and sores bloomed along her arms and legs. Her hair, once soft and carefully braided by her mother's patient fingers, matted into wild tangles. There were days when she could barely summon the strength to sit up, her muscles wasting away, her joints aching from disuse. And yet she survived. Some stubborn, defiant ember deep within her refused to go out. Every time Idris sneered at her through the crack of the door, every time a villager muttered a curse under their breath as they passed by, that ember flared hotter. She fed it with every slight, every indignity, until it grew into something sharp and hungry. At night, when the village slept and only the mournful cries of distant jackals filled the air, Amara would stare up at the sliver of sky visible through her window. She would trace the stars with her eyes, imagining herself slipping free from her cage, soaring above the roofs and fields like a spirit untethered. She began to dream of fire, not the small, comforting kind that crackled in hearths, but a roaring, devouring blaze that would swallow the world that had caged her. In her mind, she would watch the fire spread, licking hungrily at the walls, the roofs, the faces of those who had turned away from her suffering. She would see Idris's face twisted in terror, hear the villagers' screams swallowed by the roaring flames. These dreams were no longer nightmares. They were rehearsals. There were moments, rare and precious, when a bird would alight on the window's edge, peering inside with bright, curious eyes. Or when the wind would carry the scent of rain or blooming acacia trees into her prison. In those fleeting seconds she remembered what freedom tasted like, and it made her hunger not just for food but for life itself. Not the half-life Idris offered, shackled and hidden, but something vast and wild, something fierce enough to burn through the walls that held her. Her body might have been caged, but her mind had learned to slip through the cracks. She memorized the creak of every floorboard she could hear, the timing of Idris's steps, the way the walls seemed to breathe with the changing seasons. She studied her prison with the focus of a hunter learning the habits of its prey. Survival was no longer enough. She would not merely endure, she would conquer. In the endless silence of her captivity, Amara ceased being the frightened girl who had once begged for her mother's embrace. She became something harder, something sharper. She became a blade being slowly, painstakingly honed. And when the day came, she would strike with the force of all her wasted years behind her, carving justice from the flesh of those who had chained her. Vengeance was no longer a distant fantasy. It was the only future she had left. Amara's memories of her mother became like fragile glass, each one chipped and faded at the edges, easily shattered if she stared at them too long. In the beginning there had been hope. In the first days of her imprisonment she had believed, truly believed, that her mother would come for her. She would hear the soft rustle of skirts outside the door, the whisper of footsteps she knew better than her own heartbeat, and she would hold her breath, waiting. Waiting for the key to turn, for the door to open, for arms that smelled of soap and wood smoke to wrap around her and tell her it had all been a terrible mistake. But the door stayed locked. The footsteps moved past. The visits from her mother, when they did come, were brief and terrible things. The first time, Amara saw the outline of her mother's face in the dim light, half hidden behind Idris's looming figure. Her mother clutched a bundle of cloth, a bit of bread, a thin blanket, and pushed it through the gap with trembling hands. She did not speak. Her eyes flickered to Amara's face for only a second, and in that glance, Amara saw something that made her chest cave in. Not love. Not sorrow. Fear. It was not the fear of Idris's wrath, or even the fear of the village's judgment. It was fear of Amara herself. The realization hollowed her out. Her mother, her protector, the one who had once lifted her high into the air and called her the light of her life, now looked at her as if she were something cursed, something other. Idris's voice filled the silence. "She's strong enough," he said with a satisfied grunt. "The evil's not killed her yet. Maybe in time it'll leave her." Amara waited for her mother to say something, anything, to deny it, to fight for her, to cry out against the injustice. But her mother only lowered her head, nodded once and turned away. It would take years for Amara to understand what had happened to the woman who had given her life. In her endless hours of solitude, she picked apart every look, every word, every silence like a scavenger pulling apart bones for marrow. Fear was the root, she saw that clearly. Fear of Idris, who had a temper like a wildfire and fists like stones. Fear of the villagers, whose stares had grown cold and hostile. But deeper than that, buried like rot at the core of a tree, was guilt. Her mother had let it happen. Bit by bit, she had allowed Idris to chip away at her certainty, to rewrite her memories of the daughter she had once adored. She had listened to his soft-spoken lies, his warnings of spirits and bad luck, until she saw her child not as a blessing but as a burden. She had watched the village turn against Amara, and instead of standing tall, she had bowed her head, ashamed and helpless. Idris had been clever. He had poisoned her with threats that were as heavy as chains but invisible to the outside world. "If the elders find out," he had murmured in the dark, "they'll cast you out too. They'll say you raised a witch." He had painted a world where survival meant obedience, where keeping her place in the village, even if it meant abandoning her daughter, was the only way to survive. And perhaps at first she had fought it. Perhaps she had stayed awake at night, racked with guilt, planning to defy him, to free Amara. But days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and slowly, painfully, the lies became easier to live with than the truth. It was easier to believe that Amara was somehow tainted, cursed, than to face the unbearable fact that she was condemning her own child for her own survival. The last time Amara saw her mother's face was a memory that carved itself into her heart with cruel precision. It had been raining, a thin, miserable drizzle that soaked the earth into mud. Idris had opened the door, kicking a rotting loaf into the dirt at her feet. Behind him, her mother stood, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale and gaunt. She had reached out a hand, almost against her own will, as if some deep maternal instinct still stirred within her. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Only a broken, choked sound, something between a sob and a gasp. Then Idris barked her name, sharp and commanding, and she recoiled as if struck. Amara looked into her mother's eyes one last time. She searched for love, for regret, for anything she could cling to. But all she found was a vast, hollow emptiness, a woman who had already buried her daughter in her mind long ago. That was the moment the last fragile thread between them snapped. Amara lowered her eyes to the cracked floor and said nothing as the door slammed shut once more. From that day forward, her mother did not exist to her. She was no longer someone to love or forgive. She was simply another ghost that haunted the edges of Amara's broken world, a ghost that had chosen her chains over her child. And in the cold, bitter furnace of her heart, Amara's rage was tempered anew, harder and sharper than before. The darkness inside her cage was absolute after sunset, a living thing that pressed against her skin, breathing against her ears. Most nights, Amara clung to the shallow rhythms of survival, the counting of her heartbeats, the slow flexing of fingers and toes to keep the cold at bay, the bitter taste of memories she tried to chew like dry meat to distract herself from the hunger. But on certain nights, when the moon was a sliver and the village lay still as death, something else crept in through the cracks. Something older than fear, older than pain. It began as a whisper, a voice so soft that Amara thought it must be the wind snaking through the boards. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it away, telling herself it was a trick of her starved mind. But the whisper returned, night after night, threading itself through her dreams, curling into her bones. At first it spoke in fragments, words she could barely catch. Rise, burn, remember. Then came the dreams. Vivid, feverish visions that made her jolt awake, heart hammering. She saw herself standing outside her cage, her body cloaked in flame, the walls of Idris's house crumbling into ash around her. She heard laughter, hers wild and victorious, and the sound of drums beating from somewhere far, far away deep within the earth. One night, when the whispers grew too loud to ignore, she sat up, trembling, and spoke into the darkness. Who are you? The answer came not in words but in feeling, a surge of heat through her frozen limbs, a pulse of power that filled her empty chest. She felt as if something unseen had wrapped around her, not to comfort but to awaken. She saw her. A woman made of smoke and fire, with eyes like molten gold. Her hair floated around her like a living flame, her skin shimmering with the glow of embers. She hovered just beyond the reach of Amara's filthy fingers, her presence both terrible and beautiful. You are not meant to die in this cage, the spirit said, her voice a low rumble like thunder rolling across the plains. You are meant to be reborn. Amara pressed herself against the back wall, unsure whether to cry or fall to her knees. Reborn? She croaked, her voice thick with disuse and disbelief. The spirit nodded and the air grew hotter still. You are like the phoenix, child. Burned by betrayal. Scorched by sorrow. But you will rise. And when you do, the world that caged you will be reduced to ash. Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to believe, wanted to drink the spirit's words like water after so many years of drought. But fear still clung to her like a second skin. I'm trapped, she whispered. I'm too weak. The spirit's laughter filled the tiny space, low and rich. Wait. You have endured what would have broken lesser souls. Your pain has forged you into something the world fears. That is why they locked you away. They knew what you could become. As she spoke, the spirit's body flared brighter, and behind her, Amara saw visions flashing like lightning. A great fire sweeping through the village, the frightened faces of those who had turned their backs on her, the blackened ruins of Idris's house crumbling into dust. At the center of it all stood Amara herself, not the starved girl she was now, but a woman of terrible beauty, her hair crowned with fire, her arms outstretched in triumph. You must feed the fire, the spirit murmured, her voice fading as if being pulled back into some unseen realm. Feed it with your rage, your sorrow, your hope. Let it consume you. Let it transform you. The visions flickered out, and the spirit with them, leaving Amara gasping in the heavy darkness. But the ember they had left behind in her chest continued to glow, faint but fierce. She closed her eyes and saw herself not as she was, but as she would be. Not a prisoner. Not a victim. But something elemental. Something unstoppable. For the first time in years, Amara smiled. The next morning the world looked different. The cracks in the walls, once symbols of her confinement, now seemed like fractures in a shell she was destined to break through. The mutterings of the villagers beyond her cage, once daggers of shame, now slid off her like water. They were afraid of her. They should be. Every night after, when the winds howled and the shadows danced across her walls, she whispered to the spirit in the darkness. She asked for strength, for patience, for the fire to come when it was time. And in return, the spirit sent dreams, dreams of rising from the ashes, dreams of wings wreathed in flame, dreams of vengeance so pure and consuming that it left no room for sorrow. Amara was no longer waiting to be saved. She was waiting to be reborn. And when she rose, it would be in fire. It happened one night when the rains came in fierce and wild, slashing against the house with a fury that shook the very bones of the village. Thunder rumbled low across the valley, and lightning cracked the sky open, pouring pale light into every corner. Amara huddled in the corner of her cage, shivering beneath her threadbare blanket, listening to the world rage around her. That was when she noticed it, the soft groan of wood giving way. At first she thought it was the storm tearing at the roof, but as she pressed her ear to the side of the cage she felt it, a loose board, its nails weakened by years of rain and rot. Her heart stumbled into a wild rhythm, a sudden animal hope clawing up her throat. Carefully, almost reverently, she worked her fingers into the seam. Her nails, cracked and broken, dug into the splintered wood, prying, pulling, testing. The board gave a little, creaking under her touch. Not enough to slip through yet, but enough to know it could be done. Not tonight. Not with Idris still stumbling around the house, drunk and muttering. But soon. For the first time in years, the cage felt less like an end and more like a beginning. She spent the next few days studying the weakness in secret, biding her time, waiting for the right moment. Every time she heard Idris's heavy boots stomping across the floorboards, she froze, masking her growing excitement beneath a mask of the same dull obedience he had come to expect. She ate the crust he threw at her, curled up like a beaten dog, but inside she was sharpening her mind like a blade. At night, when the spirit visited her dreams, she whispered her plan into the dark. Not just escape. No, that was not enough. Running would mean leaving the wound to fester, letting him go on as if she had never existed, letting the village believe the lies they had been fed. Revenge had become her oxygen. It filled her lungs, it kept her heart beating. She thought about slipping into the night, vanishing into the trees, never looking back. It would be so easy, so tempting, to simply survive. But survival alone was no longer enough. Idris had to answer for what he had done. They all did. She remembered the spirit's words, feed the fire. Amara fed it every time she thought about the way her mother had turned away, about the years stolen from her life, about the villagers who had whispered and pointed and done nothing. She fed it with every memory of hunger, every tear she had swallowed down, every bruise on her soul. The night came when the air was heavy and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Idris drank himself into a stupor earlier than usual, snoring and mumbling from his cot. The house smelled of sour sweat and spilled beer, and the only sounds were the soft hiss of the dying fire and the sigh of the wind outside. Amara moved. Her fingers, nimble and certain now, worked the board free in near silence. She peeled it back just enough to squeeze her battered body through the gap, scraping her arms and legs against the rough wood. She landed on the cold floor with a muffled thud, her breath coming in sharp gasps. For a moment she crouched there in the darkness, frozen. She was free. She could feel the open air, the absence of bars around her. Freedom was just a few steps away, a door, a sprint into the night, into the trees, into oblivion. But her feet did not move. Her eyes, hard and unblinking, turned toward the sleeping form of Idris. The man who had stolen everything from her. The man who still dreamed easy dreams while she had endured years of nightmare. No, she would not run. She rose slowly, feeling the blood rushing in her ears like a battle drum. The room around her, once a prison, now felt like a stage set for the final act of a tragedy long overdue. Careful to avoid the loose floorboards that creaked, she padded toward the hearth. The fire was little more than glowing embers now, but that was enough. She knelt and plucked a splintered piece of wood from the pile by the hearth, thrusting it into the coals until it caught with a hiss and a guttering flame. The flame leapt and danced in her hand, wild and hungry. Like her. She turned back toward Idris, sleeping like a man who believed the world would always be his to command. He didn't stir even as she crossed the room, her shadow flickering monstrous against the walls. Amara smiled, a slow, terrible smile. This house, these walls, had been her tomb. Tonight they would be his pyre. She would not simply slip away into the dark. She would rise from the ashes. And the world would remember her name. The house slept heavily in the dark, its breath shallow and ragged like an old beast. Amara moved through its rotten guts with the careful silence of a ghost. Every board beneath her bare feet was a potential betrayer, every shadow a witness. She had waited years for this moment. She would not ruin it by rushing. The first thing she needed was fire. Real fire, not just a flickering splinter that would gut her out in the first strong draft. She needed flames that would roar and consume, flames that would lick at the sky and leave nothing but blackened memories behind. She found the oil first. Idris, in his drunken carelessness, kept clay jars of lamp oil stacked in the corner of the pantry, tucked behind rotting sacks of grain. She pried the stopper from one and sniffed it, sharp and bitter, exactly what she needed. Carefully, she rolled the jar across the floor to the center of the room where the hearth embers still glowed. She would not ignite it yet. No. Timing was everything. Next came the matches. They were hidden in the kitchen, tucked away in a tin Idris thought only he knew about. But Amara had learned the rhythms of this house better than her own heartbeat. She had heard the scratch of the match against stone on nights when Idris lit his pipes, when the world grew blurred with smoke and his mutterings. She fished out the tin, weighing it in her hand, feeling the preciousness of it. In another life she might have felt fear trembling in her limbs. But now she felt only a cold, clear focus. Every movement was deliberate, every thought sharp as a blade. She returned to the center of the house, oil and matches tucked beneath her tunic. She studied the structure like a strategist surveying a battlefield. The walls were dry, starved of moisture after a long season of heat. The thatched roof would catch easily, and once the rafters were burning, the whole place would collapse in on itself. Perfect. Still, she needed more than just fire. She needed to ensure Idris didn't wake up until it was too late. She couldn't risk him stumbling half awake and dousing the flames or escaping to rally the village against her. No, he had to be trapped, helpless as she had been. She crept to his sleeping place, careful to stay out of the line of his sight should he stir. His snores rose and fell like a dying beast's growl. At his side, half spilled from his hand, was the gourd of drink he had been nursing all evening. The scent of fermented mash was thick in the air. Good. She tiptoed to the kitchen again and rummaged through the herbs and roots he used for brewing his foul potions. Among them, she found a heavy sprig of sleepthorn, an herb the old women used in teas to calm restless children. In heavy enough doses, it could knock a man into a stupor deeper than any natural sleep. She ground the herb quickly between her palms and crept back to the slumbering form of Idris. Holding her breath, she dusted the crushed leaves over his gaping mouth and into the spilt drink at his side. He snorted once, shifted, and then sank even deeper into oblivion. Amara stood over him for a long moment, staring down at the man who had been her jailer. In the flickering light of the dying fire, he looked small, pathetic. Not the monster of her nightmares. Not anymore. With the critical pieces in place, she moved swiftly but cautiously. She sprinkled trails of oil across the main room, tracing paths along the dry wood of the floorboards and up the legs of the furniture. She doused the walls liberally, making sure to soak the support beams that held the roof aloft. The smell grew thick and heady, burning her nose and eyes. She reserved the last jar of oil for the door, the only exit. She poured it over the threshold, the handle, even the ground just outside. When the fire came, it would surround the house in a ring of flame, a barrier against any desperate escape. By the time she was finished, the room reeked of inevitability. Still she waited. She crouched in the shadows and listened. The village beyond the walls was silent, wrapped in sleep. No curious eyes, no meddling hands. Perfect. She imagined what would happen when the flames reached the roof, when the first timbers collapsed inward with a groan. She pictured Idris waking too late, coughing on smoke, stumbling blindly in a world he could no longer control. She pictured the villagers gathering at a distance, too afraid to approach, too late to help. And she saw herself standing among the trees, watching it all with eyes like burning coals. It was almost time. Amara closed her hand around the tin of matches. Her heart beat a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. Not fear, not hesitation. Purpose. This house had been her cage. Tonight it would be her weapon. And when the flames rose, they would carry her old life up into the sky, leaving only ash behind. The house slept heavily in the dark, its breath shallow and ragged like an old beast. Amara moved through its rotten guts with the careful silence of a ghost. Every board beneath her bare feet was a potential betrayer, every shadow a witness. She had waited years for this moment. She would not ruin it by rushing. The first thing she needed was fire. Real fire, not just a flickering splinter that would gut her out in the first strong draft. She needed flames that would roar and consume, flames that would lick at the sky and leave nothing but blackened memories behind. She found the oil first. Idris, in his drunken carelessness, kept clay jars of lamp oil stacked in the corner of the pantry, tucked behind rotting sacks of grain. She pried the stopper from one and sniffed it, sharp and bitter, exactly what she needed. Carefully, she rolled the jar across the floor to the center of the room where the hearth embers still glowed. She would not ignite it yet. No. Timing was everything. Next came the matches. They were hidden in the kitchen, tucked away in a tin Idris thought only he knew about. But Amara had learned the rhythms of this house better than her own heartbeat. She had heard the scratch of the match against stone on nights when Idris lit his pipes, when the world grew blurred with smoke and his mutterings. She fished out the tin, weighing it in her hand, feeling the preciousness of it. In another life she might have felt fear trembling in her limbs. But now she felt only a cold, clear focus. Every movement was deliberate, every thought sharp as a blade. She returned to the center of the house, oil and matches tucked beneath her tunic. She studied the structure like a strategist surveying a battlefield. The walls were dry, starved of moisture after a long season of heat. The thatched roof would catch easily, and once the rafters were burning, the whole place would collapse in on itself. Perfect. Still, she needed more than just fire. She needed to ensure Idris didn't wake up until it was too late. She couldn't risk him stumbling half awake and dousing the flames or escaping to rally the village against her. No, he had to be trapped, helpless as she had been. She crept to his sleeping place, careful to stay out of the line of his sight should he stir. His snores rose and fell like a dying beast's growl. At his side, half spilled from his hand, was the gourd of drink he had been nursing all evening. The scent of fermented mash was thick in the air. Good. She tiptoed to the kitchen again and rummaged through the herbs and roots he used for brewing his foul potions. Among them, she found a heavy sprig of sleepthorn, an herb the old women used in teas to calm restless children. In heavy enough doses, it could knock a man into a stupor deeper than any natural sleep. She ground the herb quickly between her palms and crept back to the slumbering form of Idris. Holding her breath, she dusted the crushed leaves over his gaping mouth and into the spilt drink at his side. He snorted once, shifted, and then sank even deeper into oblivion. Amara stood over him for a long moment, staring down at the man who had been her jailer. In the flickering light of the dying fire, he looked small, pathetic. Not the monster of her nightmares. Not anymore. With the critical pieces in place, she moved swiftly but cautiously. She sprinkled trails of oil across the main room, tracing paths along the dry wood of the floorboards and up the legs of the furniture. She doused the walls liberally, making sure to soak the support beams that held the roof aloft. The smell grew thick and heady, burning her nose and eyes. She reserved the last jar of oil for the door, the only exit. She poured it over the threshold, the handle, even the ground just outside. When the fire came, it would surround the house in a ring of flame, a barrier against any desperate escape. By the time she was finished, the room reeked of inevitability. Still she waited. She crouched in the shadows and listened. The village beyond the walls was silent, wrapped in sleep. No curious eyes, no meddling hands. Perfect. She imagined what would happen when the flames reached the roof, when the first timbers collapsed inward with a groan. She pictured Idris waking too late, coughing on smoke, stumbling blindly in a world he could no longer control. She pictured the villagers gathering at a distance, too afraid to approach, too late to help. And she saw herself standing among the trees, watching it all with eyes like burning coals. It was almost time. Amara closed her hand around the tin of matches. Her heart beat a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. Not fear, not hesitation. Purpose. This house had been her cage. Tonight it would be her weapon. And when the flames rose, they would carry her old life up into the sky, leaving only ash behind. The night was heavy with heat, the air thick and suffocating, as though the very world was holding its breath. Amara crouched in the shadows, her heart a metronome in the dark, its rhythm steady, deliberate. Every movement, every action she had taken in the past few days, had led to this moment. The fire was the end and the beginning. The house, Idris's house, the prison that had been her tomb, was about to burn. She struck the match with a slow, deliberate motion, the sound sharp in the silence. The flame caught in the dark, a small, fragile thing at first, flickering like a dying ember in a storm. For a moment, it seemed as though the world had forgotten its promise of destruction. But then the flame grew. It swelled and stretched, as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the permission to explode into life. The fire leapt from the match to the dry kindling she had spread across the floor, licking at the oil-soaked wood. For a brief instant there was nothing, just the crackle of dry timber beginning to stir. And then, in an explosion of heat, the fire bloomed, its orange fingers reaching toward the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The flames swallowed the air. They burned like the sun, but colder, sharper. They gnawed at the wood with an insatiable hunger, curling around the beams that had once held her captive. She watched, transfixed, as the fire devoured every inch of the house with slow, deliberate care. Each flame seemed to dance with the rhythm of her own pain. It was a cruel and beautiful thing, the way the fire consumed everything in its path. The walls, the furniture, the things that had once been so familiar to her, now reduced to fuel, to kindling for the flame. She saw her mother's absence in the way the fire scorched the rafters, saw her own brokenness in the way the wood splintered, cracked, and broke apart. The fire spread, crawling up the walls like a serpent, its heat so intense it seemed to sear her very soul. She could hear the wood popping and cracking, the sound of it splintering under the pressure of the flames, like bones breaking in the dark. The house was a skeleton now, hollow and empty, filled only with the sound of destruction. Amara stood in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the fire, her heart empty of mercy. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. For all the years she had spent in that cage, for all the pain and suffering, she owed Idris nothing. He had shown her no mercy. He had locked her in that cage, made her a prisoner of his twisted desires. Now he would pay. And she would be the one to watch. As the flames rose higher, casting their eerie glow on the walls, she could feel the heat on her skin, could taste the smoke in the air. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter that the fire would consume everything. It didn't matter that she was still standing there, still watching. All that mattered was that the house was burning just as she had planned. The fire was justice, the fire was release, the fire was her vengeance. The flames reached for the roof, tearing at the thatch like it was paper. They roared, hungry and wild, a chaotic dance of heat and light. Amara could see the way the fire twisted and turned, moving like a living thing, its tendrils reaching out to lick at the stars. And with each wave of heat, with each crackle of burning timber, she felt something inside her stir, something old, something fierce. She watched as the flames began to crawl up the wooden beams, up to the ceiling, until the whole structure groaned and swayed under the weight of the fire. The heat was unbearable now, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and oil. It was the smell of release, the smell of freedom. And then the roof caved in with a deafening crash, a cloud of smoke billowing into the night sky. The flames roared louder, louder, as though they were celebrating their victory, as though they were claiming their prize. And in the distance, Amara could hear the faint sound of villagers waking, their confused cries and shouts reaching her ears. But she didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see the destruction they had allowed to happen. Let them see the price of their silence. She had been the one to suffer, and now she was the one who had set the world on fire. She was the one who had taken control of her fate. The flames were everywhere now, twisting and writhing in a symphony of heat and light. The house, once so full of life and misery, was now nothing more than a pyre. The walls collapsed in slow motion, the beams snapping and splintering, sending showers of sparks into the air. And with each new crash, Amara felt her resolve harden. She had been the prisoner. She had been the one locked away. But now she was the one who held the match. The fire was a mirror. It was her rage. It was her pain. It was everything that had been taken from her, everything that had been stolen in the dark. And as she watched the house burn, as she watched the flames spread and consume, she felt nothing but the heat of vengeance in her veins. She had been the cage's prisoner. Now she was the fire. The morning after the fire was a blur of smoke and ash. The sun rose, but it was weak, obscured by a thick haze that clung to the air like a heavy blanket. The village, usually so lively in the early hours, was eerily still. Only the occasional rooster's crow broke the silence, but even that seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. The first to arrive at the scene was the village elder, a thin man whose face was carved from age and wisdom, though today he looked more tired than usual. Behind him, a few villagers had gathered, drawn by the smoke and the rumors that had begun to swirl as quickly as the fire itself. They had watched from their homes, helpless as the flames devoured the house, but no one had dared approach. Now, with the fire spent, they came to see the aftermath. What they found was a charred ruin, nothing left but the skeleton of the house. The roof had collapsed completely, and the walls were little more than blackened stumps, the wood consumed by the hunger of the fire. The air still smelled of smoke, a sharp, acrid scent that clung to the back of their throats. But there was something unsettling about the scene, something that made the villagers uneasy. There was no trace of Idris. At first, they thought perhaps he had escaped. After all, he had been known to stumble away from his troubles before. But as they searched the wreckage, as they sifted through the smoldering remains, there was no sign of him. No body. No blood. Not even a single footprint leading away from the house. It was as though the fire had claimed everything but him. The elder, a superstitious man by nature, furrowed his brow as he inspected the ruins. His eyes scanned the ground, the blackened earth, and the twisted metal remnants of the doorframe. He seemed to search for something, though what it was no one knew. "I don't like this," he muttered under his breath. "There's something wrong here." The villagers shifted uneasily. Some of them had heard the rumors, whispers of strange events, strange happenings, but no one had dared speak of them aloud. They had all seen Amara, the girl locked away for so many years. They had all seen the bruises on her body and the emptiness in her eyes when she was forced to walk through the village. They had all heard the stories too, the old ones about vengeance and the spirits who watched over those wronged. But no one had thought that the legends might be real. As they sifted through the rubble, one of the younger villagers, a boy named Osei, suddenly pointed to a patch of ground near the remains of the doorframe. "Look," he said, his voice trembling. There's something strange." The others gathered around him, peering down at the ground where he had pointed. At first it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the shifting smoke. But as they stared, something became clearer, something unnatural. In the midst of the ashes there was a dark shape, faint but unmistakable, dancing in the swirling smoke. It was not a shadow cast by the wreckage, nor was it a trick of the eyes. The shape moved with a fluid, almost human-like grace, its form shifting and twisting as if caught in the rhythm of an unseen dance. Some of the villagers stepped back, their faces pale. The elder clutched his walking stick tightly, his knuckles white with tension. "Do you see it?" one woman gasped, her voice a mix of fear and awe. "The shadow, it's moving like a person." Osei too was transfixed. It's like someone is dancing inside the flames," he whispered, his voice quivering with the edge of terror. "But there's no one there." The elder muttered an ancient prayer, the words soft and uncertain, his eyes never leaving the shifting shadow in the smoke. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, as though he feared the very words might summon something more than he intended. "It's her," he said, his voice tight with recognition. "Amara." The villagers stared at him, confused, but the elder's gaze remained fixed on the dark shape, his old mind piecing together fragments of forgotten stories. "The spirits," he whispered. "They say the wronged ones never truly leave. That their vengeance lives on even when they are gone." As the villagers continued to stare, the shadow in the flames began to shift more violently, twirling and spinning as if caught in a storm. The smoke swirled around it like a dance of its own, the heat of the fire bending and twisting the air in strange, unnatural ways. For a moment the villagers could have sworn they saw something darker, more solid, emerging from the shadows. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shape seemed to dissolve, vanishing into the smoke like a memory fading from sight. The fire had died down to a mere flicker, and the air, once thick with heat, had begun to cool. The villagers stood in stunned silence. No one spoke for what seemed like an eternity, each person grappling with the enormity of what they had witnessed. It was as if the very essence of Amara had lingered in the flames, a shadow of vengeance and sorrow that had outlived the fire itself. "She was always watching," the elder said finally, his voice hoarse. "And now, she is gone. But not truly gone. Her spirit lingers." No one disagreed. They turned away from the ruin in silence, their footsteps heavy on the earth. Some would claim the shadow was a figment of their imagination. Others would whisper that it was something far more sinister. But one thing was certain: Amara's revenge had been sealed in the fire, and her presence would haunt the village for years to come. And in the flickering embers, a single, fleeting shadow danced. Amara walked away from the smoldering ruins of the house, her feet barely making a sound as they sank into the damp earth beneath her. The air was still thick with smoke, the remnants of the fire clinging to her skin like a second layer, a ghost of the past. She had set the house alight, watching as it burned to the ground, but now, as she moved away from the place that had once been her prison, she felt only the weight of freedom, a freedom that was both exhilarating and suffocating. She was free. But the freedom felt hollow. With every step she took, the memory of the fire seemed to cling to her more tightly, burning her mind with its intensity. The flames had taken everything from her: the cage, the torment, the haunting silence of the nights spent alone. But they had also given her something she had never known before: the power to control her fate. And now that power was both a blessing and a curse. The village behind her was fading into the distance, the smoke still rising from the charred wreckage of Idris's house. She could hear the faint murmurs of the villagers behind her, but they were far away, lost in the distance. They would remember her, remember the shadow and the flames, but they would never truly understand her. They would never know the pain she had endured, the years of isolation, the brutality of a man who had stolen her life. She didn't look back. There was nothing left for her in that village. No one there would ever be able to heal the scars that marred her soul. But the scars weren't just physical. The pain, the betrayal, the feeling of being trapped in a cage for so long, it had carved something deep within her. It had forged a fire inside her that no water could extinguish, no amount of time could cool. The fire that had consumed Idris's house was still with her, alive and crackling in her chest, a constant reminder of what she had been and what she had become. The road ahead was uncertain. She didn't know where she was going, or what awaited her beyond the trees. But she was determined to find a place where no one would ever cage her again. A place where she could breathe freely without fear of being locked away or silenced. The world was vast and she was just one small, scarred woman walking through it, but for the first time in years the world felt open to her. The thought of a new beginning, of a place where she could start fresh, gave her a sense of purpose that she had never known before. The rage inside her had burned through the past, but now it was time to move forward. As she walked, the land around her shifted. The forest thickened, the trees growing taller, their branches reaching toward the sky like the outstretched arms of ancient beings. The earth beneath her feet was soft and springy, a stark contrast to the hard ground she had walked on for so many years, the dirt that had been both her prison and her companion. There was no going back. No returning to the life she had known. The fire had seen to that. But in its wake there was something else, something she couldn't quite name yet. Her fingers brushed against the rough bark of a nearby tree, and she paused for a moment, letting the feeling of the earth beneath her hands settle into her bones. It was a quiet moment, a rare one in a world that had been defined by chaos and violence. But the quiet didn't bring peace. It brought the awareness of the emptiness that she carried with her now. The emptiness wasn't just the absence of family or friends or a home, it was the absence of her former self. The girl who had been locked away, the girl who had been helpless, was gone. She had burned away in the flames, and now she had to figure out who she was without the cage, without the torment. Her steps quickened. She didn't want to linger in the silence for too long. The fire that had burned the house had also burned away the remnants of her old self. The woman walking now was someone new, someone who had learned to survive, to fight for herself in ways she had never imagined before. And yet, there was a strange, unsettling sensation in her chest. A warmth that didn't quite make sense. It wasn't the heat of the day, nor was it the sun on her face. It was something deeper, something that came from within. She could feel it, a steady pulse of warmth, like the embers of a fire that refused to die, that refused to be extinguished. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and when she opened them again she looked at the world with a different sense of awareness. It wasn't just the fire that had changed her, it was the realization that she now carried fire within her, wherever she went. It was a fire that could burn away the past, but it was also a fire that could destroy if she let it. She knew now that she had to control it. She had to find a way to live with it, to carry it without letting it consume her. Because, like the fire that had destroyed the house, the fire inside her could either be a tool for survival or a weapon of devastation. And in that moment, as she stood there in the forest, with the remnants of the village far behind her, Amara understood something vital. She would never be caged again. The fire that burned inside her was no longer a curse, it was her strength. And wherever she went, the fire would follow, lighting her path, guiding her, and if necessary, burning anything or anyone that threatened her newfound freedom. She took one last look at the smoke rising in the distance, then turned and walked on, the fire in her heart glowing brighter with each step she took toward the unknown. Amara had walked away from the ashes of her old life, her steps carrying her farther from the village, farther from the torment she had once known. Her body was scarred, her spirit too marked by the fire she had set. But in the deepest corners of her being, she felt a strange sense of release, a freedom she had never known before. The question, though, that lingered in the air around her wasn't whether she had been freed, it was what that freedom had cost her. The rage that had consumed her, the thirst for vengeance that had burned so fiercely, had turned her from a victim into something more. Was it right? Could anyone justify the destruction she had brought? Or had she merely traded one cage for another? The fire had been both her weapon and her salvation, a symbol of her pain and a mirror of her inner turmoil. But as the smoke curled in the distance, rising like a ghost into the sky, Amara knew there was no turning back. The flames had taken everything, yes, but they had also given her the strength to reclaim her life. But at what price? Survival, she had learned, came at a cost. And the price of justice was often heavier than one could bear. For all her suffering, for all her years of being locked away, had the destruction she wrought truly been righteous? Had her vengeance been a means of righting the wrongs done to her, or had it consumed her soul in the process? The truth was murky. It was impossible to tell where survival ended and vengeance began. She had fought to live, fought to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, and in doing so, she had unleashed a fury that would never be extinguished. And yet, as she moved forward, Amara could not shake the nagging feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, her act of revenge had left a scar deeper than the ones etched on her skin. Was it her soul that had been freed, or had the fire burned it away completely? With each step she took, she walked further from the past, but the memories of the fire, of the destruction, still haunted her. Every flicker of flame, every gust of wind that carried the scent of smoke, brought her back to that moment. The moment when she had let the rage consume her, the moment when she had allowed herself to become the very thing she had once feared. In the distance, the horizon stretched out before her, an endless expanse of possibility. But it was also a vast emptiness, a reminder that she was now alone in a world that no longer had a place for her. The village would never remember her the same way again. They would remember the girl who had burned their lives to the ground, the girl who had escaped her cage and left nothing but ashes in her wake. But Amara didn't need their memories. She didn't need anyone's approval or forgiveness. What she needed now was to walk forward, to create a life that was her own, free from the chains of the past. She needed to find a place where she could burn her own path, a place where the fire within her would no longer consume her, but instead light the way for whatever came next. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees around her, as if the world itself were whispering to her, urging her to keep moving forward. And so she did. In the distance, a faint shimmer of light caught her eye, like a glint of hope on the edge of the horizon. The sun, rising from behind the hills, bathed the world in its golden glow, as if offering her a fresh start, a chance to rebuild, to reshape herself into something new. And yet, even as the sun rose, she could not escape the weight of the question that hung in the air. Had her revenge been just, or had it been her undoing? Was it the fire that had saved her, or the fire that had become her? As Amara walked toward the unknown, the smoke of the past curling behind her like a phantom, the answer remained elusive. The fire would always be a part of her, both the fire that had consumed the house and the fire that burned in her chest, propelling her forward. Whether that fire would save or destroy her in the end was a question only time could answer. For now, though, all she could do was walk. Walk into the horizon, where the smoke still lingered in the sky, and the flames of the past were finally left behind, fading into the distance.